What up, guys? It's Bananaowns here, bringing you part 46 of my Skyward Sword Let's Play. We're getting really close to 50 here, and I don't know if I'm going to do a special extravaganza for it or just do a normal episode. But anyway, we're getting really close to 50 episodes. We've been doing this series for a long time, like about a month now, actually. This is my first Let's Play, and I'm getting close to finishing it, which I'm really excited about. Well, anyway, in this video, again, as I said last week, there's not a lot going on. It's mostly me just looking for some of these gratitude crystals that appear at night. So it's not terribly exciting, but it had to be done in order to complete my goals of getting basically all the gratitude crystals, heart pieces, and goddess cubes. So again, I'm probably not going to be talking about what's going on in the video as much, or if at all, because it's not terribly exciting and it doesn't make exciting voiceover. So I spent the whole last video talking about Zelda dungeons, in particular the first dungeons of games, and how they kind of established the feel and the flow and just really serve to get you immersed. They really serve to get you like into the game and just bring you in. And so I want to spend some time in this episode talking about these fourth Zelda dungeons, or I don't know, because it's kind of a different order in some of these games, but we're talking about like the first dungeon after a major plot point, like usually after you get the Master Sword in these games. So in most cases it's the fourth dungeon. So let's start with Ocarina of Time. And okay, so in this game, after you beat the first three dungeons, it's a pretty fucking huge deal that you become an adult. Like, that was absolutely crazy. And it's still one of the... Oh, sorry about that. Okay, it's still one of the best, like, I don't know, video game twists, because you see it on the menu, but it's one of the best, like, openings to the second half. We're not even second half, the second, like, the next 2/3 of the game. Just, wow. Wow. So, the fourth dungeon of Ocarina of Time is the Forest Temple. And talk about a change in difficulty. Compared to the first three dungeons, the Forest Temple is like impossible. It's just the ramp up in difficulty and like the amount of small keys you carry at one time is truly a difficult dungeon. It's very well designed indeed. It's very dark. It's like a mansion that's like all like decrepit and old and covered and basically becoming like part of the forest. And it's also really interesting because it has a Kokiri motive, I think is a good way to say it, where Link's really visiting where he grew up, basically, and seeing it fall into such a dilapidated state. So it gives you a real sense of just like, you want to fix this, you want to get all this area done, because this is where Link grew up. You got used to it in the beginning of the game, and you don't want to see it this way because there's monsters outside in the Kokiri village and this whole forest dungeon. And getting in back to difficulty, the whole difficulty it really did just ramp up. Like, I remember at one point, like, you're holding on to like 3 small keys or something, and then there's this whole like puzzle shift mechanic with a crooked room, and you have to kill all these Poes in order to get up to the boss. And just overall, it's just a really well designed and fairly difficult dungeon. It's no water temple, but it's pretty close. So Majora's Mask obviously doesn't really have one of these dungeons, which is like the second part of the game. I would say, because the second part of Majora's Mask is really, maybe you could say like the second half would be the Great Bay Temple and then like the Stone Tower Temple, but that doesn't really count because there's only 4 temples in the game. Majora's Mask really focuses more on the side quests than like the actual temples themselves. So there's nothing really of a plot point like after you get the Master Sword. So let's go to Wind Waker for opening up. You do the first 3 dungeons of the game. So your first objective in Wind Waker is to collect pearls in order to get access to the Tower of the Gods. So you do the first 2 dungeons and get pearls, but the Great Fish Isle dungeon was cancelled due to time or something. It was scrapped due to time, so they didn't really get to finish that. So you just get the 3rd pearl after like a little ghost chase. So you do the Stone Tower. You do the Tower of the Gods, which is a very interesting temple, and you get used to the command melody in Wind Waker. So you do that Tower of the Gods, and then you get sent down to Hyrule, which is frozen, and it's all grayscale, and you get the Master Sword, which leads to basically, I don't know if you'd call this the 4th dungeon of the game would be the Forsaken Fortress. I don't think it really counts since you visited there before, but now it has a boss and a heart container. So I'm gonna say it's technically the 4th dungeon, but really the second part of the game doesn't open up until after the Forsaken Fortress, where you have to restore the power to the Master Sword by finding sages. I know there's only 2 of the dungeons there, but it's really interesting because, again, as in Ocarina of Time, that's when the difficulty of Wind Waker really ramps up compared to the earlier part of the game. Of course, it's still easy compared to the past 3D Zelda games, but it still is a significant amount. And basically, that's where the game really jumps up in difficulty, especially solving some of the puzzles where you actually have to control 2 characters. You control Link and then Medley, and then in the little wind temple you control Makar. And so the first, you can do either of them in any. I don't think it matters what the order is, but most people do the Earth Temple first, which is basically like a giant tomb, which is fairly interesting because it's bringing in like this very bright and vibrant game. It's bringing into a much darker like theme. So like that encompasses the second half of the game very well, because the tone of the game really does shift in Wind Waker. It's very much lighthearted, and then after you encounter Ganondorf for the first time, that's when it gets really serious. So Twilight Princess. Let's move on to Twilight Princess. So Twilight Princess follows the typical Zelda formula, if I may say, where you do 3 dungeons, and then you get the Master Sword, and then you move on to the next 4 dungeons. What's different about Twilight Princess... A little yawn there, I apologize. What's different about Twilight Princess is after the first 3 dungeons, you get transformed into a wolf, and all hell breaks loose. And you need the Master Sword to basically purify yourself. So this whole idea of using the Master Sword like really brings in the idea of like shows like the idea of like Twilight and purifying the Twilight, which goes in perfectly with the second half of the game, really. Because the second half of the game introduces the concept of using the Mirror of Twilight. And again, I wouldn't say the game's difficulty really ramps up in the second half during Twilight Princess, but I would say that maybe considering the Skyview Temple, maybe considering the City in the Sky, and Snow Peak Ruins, I'd say the difficulty really shines, but it's not as much as the jump from basically Jabu Jabu's belly to the Forest Temple. Where Twilight Princess really succeeds is its very unique dungeons, actually. I would say that. Yeah, very unique dungeons. Because the first 3 dungeons of the game are typical Zelda, where it goes a forest, a fire, and then a water. And then almost all Zeldas have somewhat of all the dungeons follow that pattern somewhat, where they're always included. Not so much in this game too much, but in Twilight Princess it's very stereotypical Zelda. So the second half of the game really goes into deferring territory, at least thematically, for dungeons, where you go to the desert, which I know they've done it in Ocarina of Time, but it's very different, and you get a very different item, the spinner, and it's basically like a giant prison. And then the fifth dungeon is the Snow Peak Ruins, which is a mansion in the snow, where again presents a very different, typical like Zelda thing. Typical Zelda dungeon experience, where in this case, like, you're helping a couple in this home that they live in, and you, like, there's this whole thing with soup, and they give you the map and key and everything. So again, that's really, really interesting as well. And then the Temple of Time is very different because it's the first time like you really have a dungeon in that whole area. The Temple of Time is really, really, really linear and very easy to do, so I don't have too much to say about it, but it's pretty cool actually visiting like the Temple of Time, just that whole concept. And then let's see, the City in the Sky follows after that, where you go and fight a dragon, and it's really cool as well. And again, like the fourth dungeon, again, the Arbiter's Grounds, really just opens up like its spirits and opening up this idea of like the Mirror of Twilight, which is really interesting and really paves the path to the second half of the game. So let's talk about this game. So the first 3 dungeons of the game are basically you're attempting to find Zelda, and that's what drives you in the first 3 dungeons of this game. So you go through the Skyview Temple attempting to look for Zelda. You go through the what is it called? The Earth Temple looking for Zelda. And then you go through the mine looking for Zelda again. And then you finally catch up to her, which leads you to the second half of the game, which is basically forging the Master Sword. And it's slightly different in that respect, where you just don't get the Master Sword after the first 3 dungeons, and then, you know, and then move on to the second half, where you always have a sacred sword. You have the goddess sword in this, and using the flames, you have to purify it into the Master Sword. So that's the major plot point for the second half of the game. So it is already different than past Zelda games, if ever so slightly, but I'm not the one to judge here. So purifying, so bathing the Skyward Sword in the flames of the goddesses really is the driving point of the second half of the game, as I've mentioned earlier. And I really, really enjoyed this concept of the game. Basically, you're forging the Master Sword. You're making the basis of the Master Sword. And it's such a pivotal origin story for Zelda games. Just, where did this come from? We already know it was made by the goddesses. We already know that it has the power to banish evil. But how did it get there? And just this whole prophecy, I don't know, it was just appealing to my like Zelda nostalgia, or just my love of the series as a whole. But that's where this game really does excel, is in its story. It's not as good as Majora's Mask story-wise, where it's just like super dark and just different. But in regards to being a Zelda fan, the story in this game is absolutely great. It's just fan service and really establishing themes. Well, really not establishing things, but it's really like playing on themes laid out in past Zelda games, and bringing this whole concept of like the reincarnation of Demise's hatred, which I'm not going to talk into detail about because it's kind of spoiler, but I'll wait till I talk about the final boss and see how that goes before I really get into talking about like the themes. So that's what this game, I love the fact that we're making the Master Sword. It's very similar in respect to Wind Waker, where you're basically powering up the Master Sword, but in Wind Waker you're restoring power. So it's similar to that respect, where you're giving your sword a power up. And I really enjoy a little bit of story like that and dungeon fighting for that reason, because I don't know, it gives me a lot more of a motivation in games that, especially like the first 3 dungeons of Zelda games, usually go by like pretty, like, okay, there's some really well designed dungeons, but it's nothing like really too memorable. It's like you're waiting for the second half of the game, before you start getting into some of those devilish dungeons. So this game on a whole is really great, and especially the story elements, and just that is just great. I really love this game. And really, the dungeons in this game are not the hardest Zelda dungeons, but they are very well designed and make very good use of some of the puzzles, especially the ones in the later half of the game. I'd say the first two dungeons are really easy, and there's maybe it's just because of the hand-holding in this game that really makes them appear more easy. But the third dungeon is absolutely great. Lanayru Mine is absolutely great. The Ancient Cistern is absolutely great. The Sand Ship is actually great. Well, it's not as good as Ancient Cistern, but it's still pretty good. And the Fire Sanctuary is kind of meh, but it serves its purpose. And then the last dungeon of the game is freaking great. It's just a little short. And that's the only thing that goes against it, is just how short the last dungeon is. So, just this game as a whole, I know I've kind of been bashing it a little bit, considering I talk about like how the motion controls aren't always like perfect, where they like mess up like the calibration, because they need Garrus to work on those calibrations. Snuck in a Mass Effect reference there, guys. Watch out. I bet you weren't expecting that. Watch your Mass Effect reference in Zelda. Oh yeah. So anyway, this game, the problems really prevent this game from being like an absolute, I would say, masterpiece. I would say the dungeons would, especially I mentioned they're a little bit easier. I would say they're probably easier just because of Fee points out the obvious to you a lot. The Ancient Cistern and the Sand Ship especially required a lot of thinking from me the first time I played them. And the Fire Sanctuary, not as much, but still some. But really, Fee robs you of a lot of the puzzle-solving mechanics in this game with just her explanations. Or what really annoys me is her pointing out the obvious, like in the Sand Ship videos where she was like, "There's a 90% chance that there's like a monster behind this door," after like the tentacles are attacking, and you just feel like, no shit. Really? It's I don't blame like, as a character, Fee is okay, but people that really love her character kind of, I don't know what they see. I mean, she has like a very heartwarming moment at the very end, but for the most part she acts as your Navi or your Midna in this game, and she gives you too much information, I would say. And I just don't get some of it, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's very contentious point of confusing for me. So anyway, that basically covers how I feel about like the second half of the Zelda games, especially the 3D ones. It's been a while since I've played some of the 2D ones. I really need to. I started off with Link's Awakening. Actually, was very lucky to grab that game first, and then I move on to Oracle of Ages. Then I believe Link to the Past. Actually, that was the first time I played Link to the Past, was for a Game Boy Advance. And then I moved to, oh, what was it? Minish Cap. And then I know there's another one somewhere around here. And then I got a DS, and I've beaten Phantom Hourglass, but I haven't played Spirit Tracks yet. I hear Spirit Tracks isn't as good as Phantom Hourglass. And Phantom Hourglass was okay. It's just the stylus controls just didn't sit with me very well, I guess, or it was just awkward to play. And I don't know, but I beat it, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't a really defining thing of Zelda. And I don't know, I guess it's just me kind of complaining a bit about Phantom Hourglass. I will buy Spirit Tracks though one day, and I'm planning on getting a 3DS for Pokemon, as I've mentioned before. So I probably will pick up Ocarina of Time 3D just to see what that has to offer. The slight changes and slight graphical update. So for 2D Zeldas, I'm not as well versed in that. I think I've beaten all of them except for Oracle of Seasons, and I need to grab a copy of Oracle of Seasons. I was playing it on an emulator for a while, but I lost all my data on my laptop when I was playing it, so I think I was like 7 dungeons in, by the way, which really sucks because that's pretty freaking far in that game. Or 7 dungeons, there's probably less than 7 dungeons, but I was like, I think I was 1 more dungeon away from reaching like the final boss. And I don't think I'll ever do the password thing in that game as well, which I know I'm missing out a bit, but I don't have the enough time. And should I go into a bit more? I think we're about to end this video right here after we get these cursed metal, which is really helpful for finding rupees and treasures more, but you can't open your pouch, which is really a pain in the ass. And I don't think it's worth it, really. So that about concludes the video, well, this video, guys, so see you later. I mean, YOLO, right? Curse metal!